She came to support, not to speak. Sat quietly in the gallery, eyes forward, hands clenched. But the judge paused mid-sentence and stared right at her. "We need to hear from the woman who lived it," he said. She stood, heart racing. Because sometimes the one watching knows more than the ones talking. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories that blend legal drama with hidden truths, consider subscribing for more content that explores the extraordinary moments when silence becomes the most powerful testimony. The morning sun cast sharp, geometric shadows through the tall windows of courtroom 347 as Judge Harrison Blackstone entered the mahogany-paneled chamber at precisely 9 a.m. The bailiff's voice echoed through the room as spectators rose in unison, their movements creating a symphony of rustling fabric and creaking wooden benches. Judge Blackstone, a distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes that had witnessed 32 years of human drama, moved with the measured pace of someone who understood that justice required both patience and precision. He settled into his chair behind the elevated bench, adjusting his black robes with practiced efficiency while surveying the packed courtroom before him. Court clerk Margaret Chen sat at her station below the judge's bench, her fingers poised over the stenotype machine that would capture every word spoken in this chamber. At 45, she had recorded thousands of hours of testimony, depositions, and legal arguments. But today felt different somehow. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the formal tone that marked the beginning of proceedings. "We have case number 2025, CR 4891, the People versus Marcus Delacroix, continued from yesterday's session." Judge Blackstone nodded, then turned his attention to the gallery, his experienced eyes automatically scanning the faces of the observers. "Bailiff Morrison, what's our status this morning?" Judge Blackstone inquired, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of presiding over complex cases. Bailiff Thomas Morrison, a former police sergeant whose imposing frame and watchful demeanor commanded respect throughout the courthouse, stepped forward slightly. "Everything appears in order, Your Honor. Full gallery today, as expected given the media attention this case has generated. Defense counsel and prosecution teams are present. Defendant is prepared, and all witnesses scheduled for today have been accounted for." He paused, consulting his clipboard briefly before continuing. "Security has been enhanced per your instructions from yesterday's session, and we have additional personnel stationed throughout the building." Judge Blackstone's expression grew more serious as he reviewed the case file spread before him. This wasn't just another criminal proceeding. Marcus Delacroix, the defendant, stood accused of financial fraud involving a network of shell companies that had allegedly siphoned millions from a Veterans Assistance Foundation. The case had garnered national attention not just for the scope of the alleged crimes, but for the victims involved, disabled veterans, and their families who had trusted their donated funds would provide medical care and housing assistance. "The testimony we heard yesterday from the forensic accountants was compelling," the judge said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Today we'll be hearing from character witnesses and reviewing additional documentary evidence. However, I want to ensure we're exploring every avenue for truth in this matter." District Attorney Sarah Brennan rose from the prosecution table, her navy blue suit impeccable and her expression conveying the serious weight of her responsibility. At 38, she had built a reputation for meticulous preparation and unwavering dedication to justice, particularly in cases involving vulnerable populations. "Your Honor, the prosecution has prepared additional witnesses to establish the pattern of deception that characterized Mr. Delacroix's operations. We have documented evidence showing systematic manipulation of donation records, falsified medical reports, and deliberate misdirection of funds intended for veterans' care." She gestured toward a series of bankers' boxes stacked near her table, filled with financial documents, emails, and correspondence that painted a picture of calculated fraud spanning nearly 3 years. Defense attorney Robert Sterling stood to address the court, his expensive gray suit and confident bearing reflecting his reputation as one of the city's most skilled criminal defense lawyers. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges certain administrative irregularities in the Foundation's operations, we maintain that these were honest mistakes rather than criminal intent. Mr. Delacroix dedicated 5 years of his life to serving veterans, and the suggestion that he would deliberately harm the very people he fought alongside in Afghanistan is not only false, but deeply offensive. Sterling's voice carried genuine conviction, though seasoned courtroom observers noted the slight tension around his eyes that suggested he was fighting an uphill battle against overwhelming evidence. The prosecution began presenting their case methodically, calling witness after witness to establish the scope and impact of the alleged fraud. Veteran James Patterson, confined to a wheelchair after an IED explosion in Kandahar, testified about receiving false promises of medical equipment that never arrived. Sarah Williams, a widow whose husband died from service-related injuries, described how her family's housing assistance had been mysteriously discontinued without explanation, leaving them facing eviction. Each testimony added another layer to the prosecution's narrative of systematic betrayal. While the defendant sat quietly at the defense table, his expression unreadable, but his hands occasionally clenching and unclenching in what appeared to be nervous tension. As the morning progressed, Judge Blackstone found himself increasingly troubled by gaps in the testimony. While the financial evidence was damning, something felt incomplete about the narrative being presented. The character of the man described in court seemed inconsistent with the decorated veteran who had received commendations for courage under fire and leadership during multiple deployments. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said during a brief recess, "I want to ensure your client has every opportunity to present his defense. The court recognizes the serious nature of these charges and the potential impact on Mr. Delacroix's life and freedom." When court resumed after the morning break, the prosecution called their next witness, an FBI forensic accountant who had spent months unraveling the complex web of financial transactions. Special Agent Rebecca Torres approached the witness stand with a thick folder of financial records, her testimony promising to provide the mathematical proof of the alleged crimes. As she was sworn in and began her preliminary testimony, Judge Blackstone's attention was momentarily drawn to the gallery. His eyes swept across the packed benches, noting the journalists furiously taking notes, the family members of veteran victims listening intently, and the various observers who had been drawn to this high-profile case. In the third row of the gallery, sitting perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap, was a woman Judge Blackstone hadn't noticed before. Elena Rodriguez, 34 years old with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing a modest black cardigan over a white blouse, seemed somehow different from the other observers. While everyone else leaned forward with obvious interest in the proceedings, she sat with the rigid posture of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. Her brown eyes were fixed straight ahead, but there was something in her expression that caught the judge's attention. She wasn't just watching the trial unfold. She was monitoring it with the intensity of someone who had intimate knowledge of what was being discussed. Agent Torres continued her detailed explanation of the financial irregularities, using charts and graphs to illustrate how donations intended for veterans' medical care had been systematically diverted through a series of shell companies. "The pattern is clear, Your Honor," she testified, pointing to a complex flowchart displayed on the courtroom's video screen. Funds would enter the Veterans Hope Foundation account, remain there just long enough to generate legitimate-looking bank statements, then be transferred to accounts controlled exclusively by Mr. Delacroix. The mathematical precision of her testimony was devastating, each number and transaction building an overwhelming case against the defendant. However, as Agent Torres detailed the financial mechanisms of the alleged fraud, Judge Blackstone noticed something unusual. The woman in the gallery, Elena Rodriguez, was shaking her head almost imperceptibly, her lips pressed together in what appeared to be frustration or disagreement. Her reaction was subtle enough that no one else in the courtroom seemed to notice, but Judge Blackstone had developed an eye for reading human behavior during his decades on the bench. Something about her body language suggested she possessed knowledge that contradicted what was being presented as established fact. Defense attorney Sterling rose for cross-examination, attempting to poke holes in the forensic accounting by questioning the interpretation of certain transactions. "Agent Torres, isn't it possible that these transfers represent legitimate operational expenses rather than fraudulent diversions? Running a nonprofit organization requires various financial arrangements that might appear suspicious to an outsider but are actually standard practice. His questions were professional and well-prepared, but it was clear he was working with limited ammunition against the overwhelming financial evidence. The prosecution had built their case carefully, leaving few obvious vulnerabilities for the defense to exploit. As the cross-examination continued, Judge Blackstone found his attention repeatedly drawn back to Elena Rodriguez. She had attended every day of the trial, always sitting in the same spot, always maintaining the same careful composure. But today was different. Today she seemed to be struggling with something internal, as though she was fighting against a decision she didn't want to make. Her hands, which had been folded calmly in her lap for days, were now clenched tightly enough that her knuckles had turned white. Whatever knowledge she possessed, it was clearly causing her significant emotional distress. The morning testimony concluded with Agent Torres presenting the final calculations of the alleged fraud. According to her analysis, approximately $2.3 million in donated funds had been diverted from their intended purposes over a 30-month period. The impact on veterans and their families was quantified in stark numerical terms: medical equipment not purchased, housing assistance not provided, educational scholarships not funded. The numbers painted a picture of systematic betrayal that seemed impossible to dispute. Yet Judge Blackstone couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was missing from the narrative being presented. During the lunch recess, Judge Blackstone retreated to his chambers, ostensibly to review case law and prepare for the afternoon session. But his thoughts kept returning to the woman in the gallery. In 32 years on the bench, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the people in his courtroom. Defendants, witnesses, lawyers, even spectators. They all told stories through their body language and behavior that often revealed more than their spoken words. Elena Rodriguez was telling a story of someone carrying a heavy burden of knowledge, someone who desperately wanted to speak but felt bound by constraints he couldn't yet understand. The afternoon session began with character witnesses for the defense. Fellow veterans testified about Marcus Delacroix's courage in combat and his dedication to helping other veterans after his return from Afghanistan. Their testimony was heartfelt and genuine, painting a picture of a man who had repeatedly risked his own life to save others and who had continued that service in civilian life. Master Sergeant William Hayes, who had served directly under Delacroix's command, testified with tears in his eyes about how the defendant had personally carried him to safety after an IED explosion, despite being wounded himself. Marcus Delacroix is the finest man I've ever known, Hayes testified. The idea that he would steal from veterans is impossible for me to believe. As the character testimony continued, Judge Blackstone noticed that Elena Rodriguez's composure was deteriorating further. She was no longer sitting with perfect stillness. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting between the witness stand and the defendant's table. When Master Sergeant Hayes described how Delacroix had used his own military disability compensation to help struggling veterans before the foundation was even established, Elena actually raised her hand, slightly before catching herself and clasping both hands firmly in her lap. The gesture was so subtle that only Judge Blackstone seemed to notice it, but it suggested someone who desperately wanted to contribute to the testimony being presented. The defense's strategy became clearer as more character witnesses took the stand. They were painting a picture of a man whose entire adult life had been dedicated to service and sacrifice, making the prosecution's allegations seem fundamentally incompatible with his established character. Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychiatrist who had worked with combat veterans, testified about the psychological profiles of individuals likely to commit financial fraud versus those dedicated to service. In my professional opinion, she stated, someone with Mr. Delacroix's demonstrated pattern of self-sacrifice and service to others would be psychologically incapable of the calculated deception described by the prosecution. However, the prosecution's case remained formidable. During cross-examination, District Attorney Brennan reminded the court that good character, while admirable, didn't negate documentary evidence of financial crimes. Your Honor, she argued, we sympathize with the defendant's military service and previous good works, but those factors cannot excuse the systematic theft of funds intended for vulnerable veterans. The mathematical evidence is irrefutable, regardless of Mr. Delacroix's past heroism. Her argument was logical and legally sound, creating a stark contrast between emotional character testimony and cold financial facts. As the afternoon wore on, Judge Blackstone made a decision that would surprise everyone in the courtroom. During a brief recess, he had his bailiff quietly approach Elena Rodriguez with a simple message. The judge would like to speak with you privately during the next break. The woman's reaction was immediate and telling. Color drained from her face. Her hands began trembling slightly, and she looked around the courtroom as though searching for an escape route. Her response confirmed Judge Blackstone's instinct that she possessed crucial information about the case. When court reconvened, the defense continued with additional character witnesses, but Judge Blackstone found himself unable to concentrate fully on their testimony. His judicial experience had taught him that sometimes the most important evidence in a case came from unexpected sources. The formal legal process, with its rules of evidence and procedural requirements, occasionally missed crucial information simply because it came from someone who wasn't officially part of the case. Elena Rodriguez clearly had something to say, and Judge Blackstone was determined to give her the opportunity to say it. During the afternoon recess, Elena Rodriguez was escorted to a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. She sat nervously across from Judge Blackstone, who had removed his judicial robes and was speaking to her in a gentle, encouraging tone. Ms. Rodriguez, I've noticed you attending every day of this trial, and today you seem particularly troubled by the testimony. I want you to know that if you have information relevant to this case, the court needs to hear it. Justice requires that all relevant evidence be considered, regardless of its source. His words were carefully chosen to be reassuring rather than intimidating, recognizing that this woman was clearly struggling with a difficult decision. Elena's hands shook as she spoke for the first time since entering the courthouse days earlier. Your Honor, I don't know if what I know matters legally, but I can't sit there and watch this happen anymore. Everyone is talking about Marcus like they knew him, but they don't know what really happened with the foundation. They don't know about the other people involved, the pressure he was under, the threats that were made. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words carried the weight of someone who had been carrying a heavy secret for too long. I was there, Your Honor. I saw everything that happened, and it wasn't what they're saying in court. Judge Blackstone leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging but professional. Ms. Rodriguez, if you have relevant information about this case, it's important that it be presented properly. I can't discuss specifics with you outside the formal legal process, but I can tell you that the court has procedures for ensuring that all relevant evidence is heard. Would you be willing to testify about what you observed? Elena nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I didn't want to get involved, Your Honor. I was scared, and I thought maybe the lawyers would figure it out without me having to say anything. But listening to all this testimony about Marcus being a thief, I can't let that stand when I know the truth. The judge explained the process carefully to Elena, ensuring she understood her rights and the significance of providing testimony under oath. Ms. Rodriguez, what I'm going to do is reconvene court and ask if either side has any objection to hearing testimony from someone who believes they have relevant information about this case. If there are no objections, I'll have you sworn in as a witness. I want you to understand that once you're under oath, you must tell the complete truth as you understand it, regardless of how it might affect any of the parties involved. Elena took a deep breath and nodded again. I understand, Your Honor. I should have spoken up sooner. When court reconvened, an unusual tension filled the air. The regular attendees sensed that something had changed during the recess, though they couldn't identify exactly what. Judge Blackstone took his position behind the bench with the same measured dignity he had displayed all week, but there was something different in his demeanor, a sense of anticipation that suggested significant developments were imminent. Court Clerk Chen noticed the change immediately, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine with heightened attention to detail. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Blackstone began, his voice carrying the formal authority that marked important moments in legal proceedings. Before we continue with the scheduled testimony, the court has become aware of a potential witness who believes she has relevant information about this case. This individual has been observing our proceedings and has approached the court with a request to provide testimony. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. Ms. Elena Rodriguez, would you please approach the bench? The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as Elena stood from her place in the gallery. Journalists immediately began scribbling notes, recognizing that this unexpected development could significantly alter the trajectory of the trial. Defense attorney Sterling looked puzzled but hopeful, while District Attorney Brennan wore an expression of concern mixed with professional curiosity. Marcus Delacroix, who had maintained stoic composure throughout the trial, turned to watch as Elena made her way toward the witness stand, his expression showing the first genuine emotion observers had seen from him all week. Elena's legs felt unsteady as she walked the short distance from the gallery to the witness stand, acutely aware that every eye in the packed courtroom was focused on her. She had spent years trying to remain invisible, to avoid drawing attention to herself or the knowledge she carried. But as she raised her right hand to be sworn in, she felt a sense of relief mixed with terror. The truth was finally going to be told, regardless of the consequences. Bailiff Morrison administered the oath with practiced solemnity. "Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" Elena's voice was barely audible as she replied, "I do." Judge Blackstone began the questioning personally, a highly unusual step that underscored the extraordinary nature of the situation. "Ms. Rodriguez, please state your full name and occupation for the record." Elena leaned closer to the microphone, her voice growing slightly stronger as she began to speak. "My name is Elena Maria Rodriguez. I'm a certified public accountant, and for the past 4 years, I worked as the financial administrator for the Veterans Hope Foundation." The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. This wasn't just a random observer. This was someone with intimate knowledge of the organization at the center of the fraud allegations. "Ms. Rodriguez," Judge Blackstone continued, "you stated that you have information relevant to this case. In your own words, please tell the court what you observed during your time with the Veterans Hope Foundation." Elena took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Marcus Delacroix before focusing her attention on the judge. "Your Honor, almost everything that's been presented about how the foundation operated is wrong. Mr. Delacroix didn't control those financial transfers. He didn't even know about most of them until it was too late. The person who was actually moving money around was someone else entirely, someone who had access to the accounts and the authority to make transfers without Marcus's knowledge or approval." The courtroom fell into complete silence as Elena continued her testimony. "About 18 months ago, we started getting visits from a man named Vincent Carrera. He claimed to represent a group of investors who wanted to help expand the foundation's operations. At first, Marcus was excited about the possibility of helping more veterans. But Mr. Carrera's assistance came with strings attached. He insisted on having direct access to the foundation's financial accounts, claiming it was necessary for his investors to track how their money was being used." Elena's voice grew steadier as she continued, drawing strength from finally telling the truth she had kept hidden for so long. "Mr. Carrera brought in his own people to handle the financial operations. They set up the shell companies and the complex transfer systems. Marcus was told it was for tax efficiency and to protect the foundation from liability issues. He trusted them because they seemed professional and because he genuinely believed they were trying to help veterans." Elena paused, her voice beginning to tremble with emotion. By the time Marcus realized what was really happening, Mr. Carrera's people had embedded themselves so deeply in the foundation's operations that Marcus couldn't remove them without destroying the organization entirely. District Attorney Brennan rose to object, but Judge Blackstone held up his hand. "Ms. Rodriguez, these are serious allegations you're making. Do you have any evidence to support what you're telling the court?" Elena nodded, reaching into her purse to withdraw a small device. "Your Honor, I've been recording conversations and copying documents for the past year. I knew something was wrong, but I was too scared to come forward earlier. Mr. Carrera made it very clear what would happen to anyone who interfered with his operations." She handed the device to Bailiff Morrison, who delivered it to the judge. "Ms. Rodriguez," Judge Blackstone asked carefully, "why didn't you come forward with this information sooner? And why are you choosing to testify now?" Elena's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face as she answered. "Because Mr. Carrera threatened my family, Your Honor. He knew where my children went to school, where my elderly mother lived. He made it clear that if I ever spoke about what I had seen, something terrible would happen to the people I love. But sitting in this courtroom, watching Marcus be destroyed for crimes he didn't commit, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. Some things are more important than fear. The implications of Elena's testimony were staggering. If her allegations were true, then Marcus Delacroix wasn't the mastermind of a complex fraud scheme. He was another victim of it. The real perpetrator was someone who had deliberately targeted the Veterans Hope Foundation, knowing that its founder's reputation and the emotional nature of its mission would provide perfect cover for financial crimes. Ms. Rodriguez, Judge Blackstone continued, you mentioned recordings and documents. What exactly do these materials contain? Elena straightened in her chair, her voice becoming more confident as she detailed the evidence she had gathered. The recordings include conversations between Mr. Carrera and his associates discussing how to manipulate Marcus and the foundation. They talk about using the veterans' stories to generate sympathy donations while systematically stealing the money. There are also recorded phone calls where Mr. Carrera explicitly threatens me and other employees who ask too many questions about the financial irregularities. She paused, wiping tears from her eyes before continuing. The documents include emails showing the real structure of the shell companies and bank records proving that Marcus never had access to the accounts where the stolen money was actually deposited. Defense attorney Sterling was on his feet immediately, requesting an immediate recess to examine this new evidence. District Attorney Brennan looked stunned, realizing that her carefully constructed case might be based on incomplete information. Judge Blackstone granted the recess, but not before asking Elena one final question. Ms. Rodriguez, where is Vincent Carrera now? Elena's answer sent another shockwave through the courtroom. He disappeared 3 days before Marcus was arrested, Your Honor, along with all the money and most of the financial records that could have proven Marcus's innocence. During the extended recess, Elena's recordings and documents were examined by both legal teams and court officials. The evidence was devastating to the prosecution's case and completely exonerated Marcus Delacroix. The recordings revealed a sophisticated operation designed to exploit veteran-focused charities, with Carrera and his associates specifically targeting organizations led by decorated veterans because of the trust and credibility such leaders commanded. Marcus had indeed been manipulated, threatened, and ultimately framed for crimes committed by others. The most damning piece of evidence was a recorded conversation in which Carrera discussed his plan to ensure that Marcus would be arrested and convicted for the fraud. The beauty of this setup, Carrera's voice explained to an associate, is that no one will believe a war hero could be innocent. They'll assume he's just another veteran who couldn't handle civilian life and turned to crime. By the time anyone figures out what really happened, we'll be long gone with the money. The recording made it clear that the entire operation had been designed to destroy Marcus Delacroix's life, while the real criminals escaped with millions of dollars. When court reconvened, District Attorney Brennan stood to address the judge with obvious difficulty. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence presented by Ms. Rodriguez, the prosecution is requesting a dismissal of all charges against Mr. Delacroix. It appears that he was not the perpetrator of these crimes, but rather another victim of a sophisticated fraud operation. We will be working with federal authorities to locate Vincent Carrera and his associates. Her voice carried the professional dignity of a prosecutor who had discovered that justice required admitting a mistake rather than pursuing a wrongful conviction. Marcus Delacroix wept openly as the charges were dismissed, but his tears were not just of relief. They were of gratitude toward the woman who had risked everything to tell the truth. Elena Rodriguez had chosen courage over safety, truth over silence, and in doing so had prevented a devastating miscarriage of justice. As court was adjourned, Marcus approached Elena with tears in his eyes. Why? He asked simply. Why did you risk your family's safety for me? Elena's answer was immediate and heartfelt. Because that's what you would have done for any of us. Because it was the right thing to do. Judge Blackstone remained in his chambers long after the courtroom had emptied, reflecting on the day's extraordinary events. In 32 years on the bench, he had learned to trust his instincts about people, and those instincts had led him to notice Elena Rodriguez's silent struggle with knowledge she felt compelled to share. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important witness in a case is the one who never intended to testify at all. Justice had been served not through the formal legal process, but through the courage of one woman who chose truth over fear. The case would have far-reaching implications beyond Marcus Delacroix's exoneration. Elena's evidence led to a federal investigation that uncovered a network of similar fraud operations targeting veteran and military charities across the country. Vincent Carrera and his associates had stolen millions of dollars from organizations dedicated to helping wounded warriors, disabled veterans, and military families. The investigation ultimately led to multiple arrests and the recovery of substantial funds that were returned to their intended beneficiaries. Elena Rodriguez became something of a reluctant hero in the veteran community, though she consistently deflected attention and credit for her actions. She had simply done what she believed was right, despite the personal cost and risk involved. Her testimony had saved an innocent man from prison and exposed a criminal network that had been operating with impunity for years. Marcus Delacroix was not only exonerated but was eventually appointed to lead a new federal task force dedicated to preventing fraud against veteran-focused charities. The story of Elena Rodriguez serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important voice in a room belongs to someone who never intended to speak at all. Her quiet observation from the gallery had revealed more truth than weeks of formal testimony and expert analysis. In choosing to overcome her fear and speak out for justice, she had demonstrated that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they choose courage over comfort, truth over silence, and justice over personal safety. Sometimes the one watching truly does know more than the ones talking, and sometimes that knowledge can change everything.